My name is Angela Dimayuga. I'm a chef, multidisciplinary artist, cultural producer based in Brooklyn, New York. Um, I have a lot of interests. I think just naming all the things that I could possibly identify with is pretty abstract, just because I find myself to be a really curious person, and a lot of these interactions happen by way of food, and that's sort of how I've I think connected with my community or have have had opportunities to work with a lot of different folks. Um, some projects that I'm working on right now and in the future are really exciting to me. I just released a cookbook called Filipinx, Heritage Recipes from the Diaspora. That was a project I had been working on for about 2 years, primarily during the pandemic, and got to work with a dream writer, co-writer, also Filipino-American, Lagay Mishan, who was raised in Hawaii. So it was really beautiful to have two femme Filipinas of the diaspora come together to make this passion project, and find that it really drew us closer to understanding ourselves more. And I think that journey was really introspective, and so introspective that more than I could have imagined. And I think a part of that is getting to look backwards rather than only forward. And I think being first generation, sort of leaving my family in the Bay Area at 17, and not really looking back to sort of understand my own ambition and ideas of success so that I could make them proud. I hadn't really looked back as much, focused so much on my career being in New York, and traveling. And so I feel like that was just such a beautiful project to sort of look at as a time capsule of my experience, up until the age of 35. But looking at how I related to my family and my experience being a young person in the Bay Area till I was 17. For me, this is like a dream project because I'm getting to work with a lead researcher. I'm getting to work with a group of really amazing contributors, 5 of them that all do very specific things. One of them is a lead technician of a fermentation lab at the Crick Institute. One of them is a food historian. And for example, it's just everyone has these really beautiful specialized work that they're bringing to the table. And the project is to compile an online open source archive called the Compendium. And the topic will be around fermentation, but I'm really excited because I'm looking at fermentation very abstractly. And I think my goal as a curator is to think about a really pointed POV to start this archive, where we're looking at, and as a professional chef, or a chef that has worked in the restaurant industry and seen fermentation become something really popular within restaurant kitchens, but then also is a word that I think we use in our households at this point, sort of attached to wellness, and in the westernized POV, of course. But I love this idea of kind of questioning these practices of thinking about fermentation, at least from the restaurant world, looking at it as a scientific and sort of Western imperialized empirical practice, where it's very related to science, which of course is really important to understand microbiomes, et cetera. But for me, I think there's a deep interest in looking as far backwards as we can, because these are, practices that are hundreds of years old, maybe more than that, and kind of understand what our pre-colonial relationship to this, what feels like magic of turning one product into the next. Gush is a party I started in 2017. And at the time I was a workaholic. I call myself a workaholic in recovery, because I feel like I'm really trying to be intentional about the projects that I'm participating in. And Gush is something that I've been happily organizing since 2017. And for me, I just as a queer femme, there wasn't really any sort of nightlife that I felt comfortable going to, and it was exciting for me to think about having confidence starting a party, just because I had created these like fun experiences at restaurants, etc. And I organized a party where there was an interdisciplinary aspect. And this is all things that we do that's not didactic. We don't verbally describe all of these intentional methods in how we describe the party. But it's always really important for us to find hosts, maybe 6 to 8 hosts who are from very different backgrounds. And by that, I mean maybe ethnically or the work that they do, and maybe also aren't really participants of nightlife, but might enjoy the party. Same thing with our DJs. We always book various talent for DJs. Maybe they're from other cities or other friend groups, and maybe there's also a DJ or two that has never DJed before, but I know they might be a really great selector and can contribute some really fun different types of music for the evening. And then we always have a performing artist, a musician, maybe a rapper or an R&B singer or something like that. And then another really important element is our resident dancers who do basically exotic dancing. We have a femme and stud stripper. I think to have an opportunity to see this act of like sexuality among two women, not for the male gaze, I think is really important. My parents decided to go to South San Francisco for the good weather and the other Filipino community members that's out there. We had some cousins that weren't blood cousins, but people that I refer to as cousins now. And we were raised in the Bay Area. They first settled in South San Francisco, but by the time I was born, I was raised in San Jose, which was hotter, drier, more suburban. Ideas around like this immigrant success of being able to have a home, like a brand new home for me and my siblings. And I have 5 siblings. So I grew up in a really boisterous environment of a lot of, different age kids doing suburban kid stuff, like working at the mall. I was part of the younger set, and I had older siblings that I thought that I could look up to, that I thought were cool. The culture then was, I was really inspired by music and the diversity. San Jose is it's 30% Asian and 30% Mexican. And so I was around what I refer to as a brown culture, a homogenization of brown culture, where I think like aesthetics of Filipino teens really merged with this like Mexican American aesthetic, which I thought was really cool, and was like one of the reasons why I still wear brown lipstick. Like I've always worn brown lipstick, and it's from that time period of like envisioning what like cool hot older girls wear. And so that was what I was raised around, was like rice rockets and b-boys and a lot of Filipinos being DJs, and breakdancing, pop locking, like all this specific types of dancing. And then getting a little older, finding my own interests in like alternative music and punk pop and things, and emo and things like that. Music that really came from a Black culture in the US, that it seemed that Filipinos were, instead of being appropriative, like celebrating Black music. And that's what I mean by like the Filipinos that I was around were all like DJs and scratchers and like b-boys, like sort of celebrating that music rather than trying to make it their own, or like adding themselves into something that wasn't a part of our culture or our American culture. So I found that really fascinating. And then also being in San Jose, which had a huge Filipino population, I found myself sort of in a leadership position in my school for the Filipino Student Association. And that kind of just happened because I was just very social, and the Filipino Student Association is a social club, and it all amounts to organizing a 3-hour play, PCN, which Filipino Cultural Night, that like, many high schools and colleges have around the US. And, that was encouraged because my sister was really active in it. And my mom was a Bayanihan dancer. So she was kind of our mentor and costume maker. And that really, I think, started our relationship and closeness around appreciating Filipino culture. It kind of just happened to me where I was very active in it. Everyone knew my mom was a dancer. And then one year I just tried out, I just tried out to be like the vice president of the club. And then I got that role. And then the following year I was the vice president again. I kind of just did it to have fun with my friends. We would all just do practices for like 3 months before the program. So that meant we were practicing folk dancing, or if you were into acting, you would act, or just there was a job for everybody. And it wasn't just for Filipinos. And so we would have these practices at people's homes. And my mom was just super happy to be a mom to like 40 kids that would come over after school and do like little practices of folk dancing, like 2 sets on their 3-car garage, 1 on the lawn, 1 in the backyard, 2 on the street, just kids everywhere, having a good time.
My name is Pfeiffer, and I'm an artist, and I work in video, and I like to work with video, especially found footage, and other media as well. Like I've been shooting more film, more and more, and also just thinking about kind of the relationship between found footage and which nowadays would be almost synonymous with like internet stuff you could download from the internet, and then making or shooting one's own footage, or kind of traditional filmmaking processes versus like post-production processes that have all that have become everyday processes by virtue of the devices that we carry around, that we sort of like self-fashion with, and how much that inflects how we think about art and culture on every level. Like it's all kind of, there's many distinctions to be made, but there's many conversations happening between people in different fields, but there's also, to me, a way in which just the speed of social media and the internet like are definitive at this point of like culture in general. And I've been working on 2 projects in particular that originated before the COVID years. And so like I'm in the process of picking back up on things that originally entailed production process where I was traveling. One of them was the Incarnator project that took me to the Philippines, where I was working with like some of the leading religious image makers in the Philippines, people who make wooden statues of the Virgin Mary and the crucified Christ and the Santo Niño, from both Pampanga and Laguna, the 2 provinces that are most famous for this type of production. And I was commissioning them to make portraits of Justin Bieber, who I was thinking of as like a kind of contemporary manifestation of the Santo Niño, which as a figure, the baby, the child king, has a particular history and is fascinating to me because he represents seeming opposites, like innocence of a child, and also the kind of worldly power of a king. And in the guise of Justin Bieber, he has a very strong resonance with like the kind of the complexities of global capitalism. That combination of like the innocence of, you know, the crowd of child believers, all aspiring to the kind of worldly agency of a pop star, of a child pop star. That combination of like seeming innocence and like ultimate corruption in a way, as a kind of emblem of capitalism. So that was one project. And so, you know, because I was working with religious image makers in the Philippines, I sort of had to really slow down, if not halt, my production the past couple of years, and I'm just picking back up. And in the interim, I made a connection to the counterpart religious image makers in Spain, specifically in Sevilla, which is like the kind of historical ground zero for this type of religious image making. Like it goes back centuries. Yeah, my family, I was born in Hawaii and grew up traveling and going to school in Hawaii, but also in the Philippines, in the south of the Philippines, in the city of Dumaguete, where my mother's from, and where my dad is not from, but he migrated there in the early 50s from New Jersey, and then spent a lot of the rest of his life there, teaching music, which my mother also is a musician and music teacher, and eventually becoming interested. And my father became a student of ethnomusicology and was involved in, you know, some of the early kind of collection of field recordings of indigenous music in the Philippines. This is in the 60s and 70s, through the University of Hawaii and Ford Foundation. So I grew up, because he was doing this research and because both of them were teaching music in Hawaii, but also at a particular school, Silliman University in the Philippines, an American university. I grew up traveling between Hawaii and the Philippines.
Can you talk a little bit about your relationship to music?
Yeah, both of my parents were church musicians, and so in a way, I grew up in the church in a particular way, studying or just being around the production of music as it's used in the context of Protestant ritual, which, unlike Catholicism, does not have, well, has a very restrained kind of visual culture compared to Catholics. And so a lot of the kind of like smoke and spectacle in a way comes through the music. So in a way, I feel like I was adjacent to my parents and a kind of community of musicians who, my whole upbringing, who were involved in creating that kind of musical accompaniment, which is the kind of emotional generator, the affective generator of the Christian rituals. I would say that's the kind of starting point for me of my relationship to music, which is to say, in a way, it's like sort of behind the curtains a little bit, like hearing people, I mean, hearing choirs and organists and keyboardists practicing repeating, stopping, do it this way, do it that way, you know, acoustic dynamics in church spaces, and how to, all of these kind of like technical matters behind and leading up to the performance, where then the crowd is there.
Is your relationship and like your relationship to music, do you feel like that is foundational to to your work or to your process?
I mean, not in an intentional way. I did, all of the children of my parents studied music at some point, but they didn't also really encourage us to follow them. So in that sense, there wasn't, very few of my siblings and really went in very far into music. But after the fact, I realized that even though I got into video for other reasons, that it just became clear to me, to any medium that is time-based is related to music. So, a lot about like how I think about video on an intuitive level, including repetition and now more and more like exploring more kind of narrative structures, could have like a very obvious counterpoint in music composition, and certainly like experimental music composition. Yeah, in fact, this is a kind of a longer detour, but just to mention that one thing I'm really fascinated with, or one figure that I'm really interested in, is the ethnomusicologist Jose Maceda, who was trained in France, but then went back to the Philippines and was involved in the study of indigenous kind of, instrumentation and music cultures in the Philippines. But because he studied in France and had interactions with kind of the musical and artistic avant-garde, like John Cage and others, he brought some of that kind of thinking. And so he wears these kind of two overlapping hats, one as a kind of ethnomusicologist, and at the same time, this other like strange hat as like somebody who was using indigenous musical traditions to explore like sonics in a way that really related to the kind of the context of like the avant-garde. And I think he's considered now, like he was active in the 60s and 70s. He did some like famous performances under the Marcos dictatorship that had like a political dimension to them, like connecting people throughout the Philippines via by asking them to tune in to a particular radio station, where a kind of fragmented performance would happen in a dispersed way, but then would come together by everybody tuning into the same station. Things like this, he was already experimenting with in the 70s. And that to me is super intriguing. The University of Philippines now has a center called the Maceda Center, like ethnomusicology center, that houses his archives. And yeah, I know a little bit about this because of my dad's relationship to the field. But I think there's much more to explore. Now in 2022, after over 20 years since that Fulbright experience, like I really increasingly, like it's always been a part of my practice to produce work in the Philippines. Like a lot of my work has been produced in the Philippines through Filipino sculpture fabricators, but also through like teams of video editors that do a lot of kind of like meticulous editing for me to do things like erase boxers from a boxing ring. Because of course, like, you know, there's a very intense like network that has to do with outsourcing labor in the Philippines. And my interest in structuring my studio and my practice this way was really aligned with the idea that, you know, that to do it in this way would have to pick up the texture that's in the environment that is almost like the residue and the kind of the sediment of like a really long history. Like to work with religious image makers, that's, you know, these are families of image makers that go back generations, literally centuries. Like there's a town in Pampanga that's known for wood carving called Betis. And there's like an area in Sevilla called Betis. Like the, you know,
Yeah.
and so all of that, I mean, that's just like on the level of like names, but you know, the aesthetic kind of like texture of everything, to me, like reveals aspects of history. So like I've always liked the idea of having a studio that in which things are produced in the Philippines, as a way to just kind of imbue objects and images with that texture.
Do you feel like there is a moment or a turning point for the work that you did in the Philippines that has made it important to you to have your studio there, to have it in your work infused with the environment? And
Yeah, you know, it's like I was thinking about people who I pay attention to, and or like kind of developments in culture that I follow. And what do I want to say? Like one of the people that I'm really interested in is the journalist Maria Reza. Like she is, or yeah, she's based in the Philippines. She's the founder of Rappler, but she worked for many years before that for CNN. And she is, I guess, like people think of her as Filipino American. And she's been involved in like in journalism, investigative journalism. And in fact, you know, she just was the first, what is it? First Filipino recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, just this past year or two ago, for the kind of impact that Rappler has had, and particularly for like the investigative reporting around, you know, extrajudicial killings in the Philippines under Duterte, and the way in which she was both like kind of like, you know, targeted and attempted, you know, censored by the Duterte government, and her like kind of fearlessness to not stop anyway. But like one of the things that I've heard her say, and that she's really been clear about is, you know, talking about how to understand what's going on in the Philippines and the role that social media plays in kind of siloing and constructing a sense of manufactured reality, because of the, you know, like the use of social media via trolls and through kind of like censorship in that context. is really like a new thing, and to understand it, specifically Facebook, which is, you know, like used by almost like 100% of the population in the Philippines. So like the influence that it has in terms of manufacturing public opinion is like really extreme. And she says like to understand it, like one really has to go beyond the Philippines and look at Silicon Valley. So I feel like she's been one of the kind of public intellectuals, kind of like one of the really strong voices in the world, really attuning the global public to the level of like influence beyond the law that social media companies like Facebook have now. So in some ways, like, again, I'm like a little bit lost from your question, but to me, this is like a kind of consciousness that it doesn't seem arbitrary that this is coming from a Filipino American journalist. Like her involvement with CNN, like one of the biggest kind of journalistic outlets of the United States, and then the transition to founding Rappler as a kind of investigative journalism platform in the Philippines. It seems like a very proactive kind of understanding of relationships and a kind of tactical or like strategic creative agenda. And that, you know, that really interests me. And I think there are counterparts in the form of like artists exploring artist cinema, filmmakers exploring kind of documentary filmmaking and going beyond, way beyond traditional documentary into like really experimenting with how these tools can be used without falling into the traps of kind of like, you know, a very like pacifying kind of quote unquote objective, authoritative, like simplified storytelling, but really like ways of working with documentary form to really expose complexity. I think there's artists, filmmakers, and really throughout culture, people like playing with the tools in a very expansive way that I think needs to happen. And I'm super curious, particularly around documentary, like where the stakes are very high because, you know, you're really dealing with like real lives and like real violence. Like just for example, yeah. I made a short list, you know, there's, I mean, for one, there's like a group of photographers in the Philippines called the Night Crawlers that have taken it on as an agenda to, over the past, since 2016 at least, to like day by day document extrajudicial killings, to just simply like as they happen, you know, and before they can be erased. Photos are taken of the scenes and of like the bodies, you know, sort of just yeah, that fascinates me. I guess it's like war journalism in a way. And there's a filmmaker, I mean, well, there's many filmmakers, but like just recently in 2019, there was a film called Aswang by the filmmaker Alex and Arumpak, which is like similarly like, you know, kind of reportage on the ground. It's not unproblematic, you know, in a way. It raises like really complex ethical issues, but I just find the desire to kind of move out of, say, like a mindset where like making an image is separate from reality, to actually exploring the relationship between image making and reality to be like really compelling. And I think, you know, there's folks in the Philippines and in the US among Filipino Americans who are really focusing on this. It's interesting to me how like uh like um like there's Filipinos everywhere, and they, you know, they group as such, and at the same time they sort of like, you know, integrate or intermarry, or like there's a natural way that like I think, you know, and that Filipinos like they journey out, and they get sort of like involved in all kinds, you know, they're like almost like born navigators, maybe even like mediums, like in the sense of like translating or interpreting or like, you know, speaking multiple languages, like disappearing into like the environment, so that you're like, oh my God, like that's Filipino, so and so is Filipino, because like, you know, there you see them on like every level of society, like I don't know if you want to say passing, but at any rate, there's this like way that yeah, I guess I want to, that their like mixture defines the culture. Like I feel like there's an aspect of like an affinity, say like with hip hop, and like with remix culture in contemporary Filipino culture, that like, you know, you could easily point to like the jeepney as like, you know, an emblem of how like, you know, taking like military vehicles from World War II and like just like repainting them into, and turning them into kind of like a visual display and also a form of public transportation. Like this is like well worn territory in terms of like finding metaphors for what Filipino culture is. But then like in the age of the internet, like we can talk about like remix on like a global scale as like, and you know what people in fashion and art and film are doing in that way.
I am Avena Gallagher. I am a stylist, a fashion stylist, but primarily now I work at Telfar, where I am a partner in the company and the fashion director, whatever that means. It's just more or less that I've been working at the brand since 2004 and building it. I brought my partner in, Bodhi, in like 2014, or we you know, got him, or he joined Telfar and I, and it's really grown a lot in the past few years. So that's kind of like my main job now. But you know, for years I've been working as a freelance person, as a stylist for hire, and also a volunteer stylist for, you know, things that generally are on the outskirts of kind of fashion and commerce, and sometimes in that same gutter between fashion and art. So yeah, I work with clothes.
Can you share how that started for you?
I mean, I could take it all the way back, you know, from just being like my mom's daughter, and my mom had dreams of being a fashion designer, and she was really into getting dressed up and was really into fashion and design and stuff. And I think those ambitions were kind of cut short because she had me when she was like finishing up high school or something. So I think I inherited it. And also just growing up in a household of like, you know, grandparents, a kind of rotating extra uncles or aunties or relations 5 siblings. And now, you know, there's like 8 grandchildren, and and nobody ever really throwing things away. So the house was full of clothes always, you know, from the upstairs, like from the attic to the garage, just, and outside even, like sheds full of clothes, boxes, you know, like I've just been surrounded by clothes. And then my paternal grandparents were like clinical level hoarders. For the most part, I've been like, you know, just trying to survive and trying to be authentic, you know, and trying, you know, it's like I am a creative person. Like I said, there were times where I thought, like, let me just get some kind of practical job because I need to sustain myself and I can't rely on anyone else. And you know, I come from really fucking hard workers. And I think any immigrant or first generation or whatever person knows that, you know, like you fucking have to work. And so that's all I did, really. I just worked, tried to be me. And, you know, it definitely paid off very recently, you know. So I'm just grateful. But, you know, it's just like, I think, yeah, my family's proud of me. You know, it's like, just like I've been keeping my head down until I could show them the money. And like now I've been able to do that and everyone's like, yay! You know, like, well, I mean, I certainly was, you know, always attracted to images of like, you know, glamorous women who were dressed really glamorously. I was, you know, like I was always a magpie that would always, you know, follow these sort of things that struck me visually. Magazines. My mom would always have like Vogue and things like that around. And so I would see beautiful things there. And, you know, I'd always just kind of like take in what they were wearing and stuff like that. I mean, those were the things that influenced me. I also like was always like enamored of like cities, like big cities, metropolises, like skylines, things. I always knew that I wanted to live in the city. And a really random thing, but a really formative thing was that I was in the like dance team, drill team as a teenager. And I came to New York at 14 or 15 to dance in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade as like a toy soldier person, you know, like with the red cheeks. Like, you want to do this thing, how are you going to do this? So all of that influenced me, which I mean, you could say is living in New York, you know, the world around me. I'm always influenced by just always just regular people, like other people just doing this thing of trying to survive. And, you know, lately that's getting more acute, or, you know, as I'm getting older, it's taken on a more serious tone, you know, and I've built new awarenesses that I wish I'd had all along, you know, and I intend to deepen my clarity in like how empire and colonialism and white supremacy and capitalism have forced the shape of my life, have forced the shape of my future, of my past, you know. I think this is what's really at the forefront of my thought processes when I was reflecting on being here with you and these questions that you're asking me about, because it is such a complex and kind of heartbreaking thing, I think, for me to consider, like, what is a Filipino voice? Like, what is a Filipino aesthetic? Like, on the one hand, like, I can talk about, like my aunties or my grandma or these nice angles of it, But then on the other hand, it's like, well, couldn't say I was privileged enough to consider my background a heritage or like a culture. You know what I mean? I feel like these are kind of bourgeois like positions that like I don't come from. And what I feel more realistically is like the Philippines is a colony. It was a parade of different people's colonies. The Philippines is like a breeding ground for like, raw material and people, like the cheapest people in the world. Like everybody can have a Filipino. The word for made in China is Filipina. Like this is we narrowly escaped it, and it hurts me a lot to consider, and it hurts me to realize like, wait, like there's like a lot of different things we're talking about here. Like I can't actually just talk about like, Filipino art or something, because what are the conditions that allow somebody to be a Filipino artist? And then like for whose gaze, like, what is it? What is Filipino-ness here? It's 2022. Like I'm Filipino, I can't even say. So, I mean, I'm glad to be made to think about these things because I want to have more to say, and I want to fully form these ideas or have it be more of a prevalent conversation. I've always had like ideas of art projects. I've executed very few of them. I never went to art school or anything. And anyway, one art project was that I wanted to set up what kind of looked like a street store on the street, but that no one was in attendance to. And then also maybe just record it and see what would happen if people would take stuff, which then kind of turned into like they should take stuff. So it was going to be indicated that the shit was for free. And then, so I was going to do that. And it was a way for me to also rationalize this like constant hoarding of stuff. And then of course, in my line of work, that was like a major occupational hazard because I would gather stuff and then, not be able to let it go. So it would just pile up. And so then, yeah, I was like, okay, I'm saving this because I'm gonna do free sale, whatever. And then it just got out of hand. I just kept saving more and more stuff. And the very first one was at Rob Pruitt's flea market. So I had a stall of free stuff. So I think there have been four or five iterations, and the last one I think that I had in December of 2019 was the most fully formed, probably the biggest. It was a department store. It was like holiday time. We had a Santa. I had like Chinese street musicians playing out front. I mean, it was really actually became for this tiny period of time like a really active hub in the neighborhood. That was very popular with like the kind of senior citizen Chinatown set, and it just attracted all the right people. I feel like, if you're providing something and there's a need for something, there's a magnetic attraction.
Yeah, I think that all those words that you just use are part of like the Filipino American psychic, be exorcism, resistance to capitalism. What was the other thing you said? You said, so I feel like you, I mean, I always thought that maybe you were aware of this, but it always feels like the things you make, the way you look, the way that you do things feels like this very, what do you, this very distilled idea of Filipino-ness
I
that,
think so. Not intentionally, but I think you're right.
yeah,
I thought about that when just trying to answer some of these questions. It was kind of like, well, all roads lead back to that,
yeah,
actually, which
yeah,
is, you know, kind of funny. It was really organic. And then there, you know, I guess at some point we hit some sort of flashpoint and got over the hump of, you know, having like a creative practice, and we have a business now. And it covers all the things that I talked about as far as, you know, being Filipino, but you could transpose it into, you know, being Black. Like, it's a Black business, it has a Black following, it's sustained by Black customers, it means something, you know. It is like activism without trying to be, it's community action without necessarily having meant to be. And you know, I feel really lucky to be able to call it my life's work at this point, you know, because yeah, you know, it's kind of, it is everything. Like, I mean, all of this is everything, but like, it means all the, it has all the right things in it for me to just do no matter what, you know, whether it was sustainable or not, whether it was sustaining or not, like, I'd still be doing that work.
My name's Josh Klein. I'm an artist, meaning like contemporary art. I work in installation, video, sculpture, images, basically everything except painting. I don't work in painting. No interest in painting really as a subject or as an activity, although I have done it. It is enjoyable. Right now I'm going into production on 3 or 4 new videos that I'm going to shoot over the summer for a show coming up next year that I am not allowed to talk about right now. And these videos are also part of a larger installation that has to do with the climate crisis and migration and refugees, actually, like economic migration, involuntary migration due to climate-related catastrophes, but also due to economics. And she was 29 when she came to the States and had been living in Manila before that, I believe teaching at UP at the University of the Philippines. She was a chemist. Yeah, like both my parents were scientists. And I think basically her and like much of her graduating class from UP were brain drained into the US at the end of the 60s to work in the pharmaceutical industry. So that's how my mom got to the States. I didn't grow up physically in a Filipino community, but you know, like basically every weekend we were in New Jersey going to parties. My mom would cater. Like, she left her job once she had me and then, you know, did a bunch of jobs throughout the rest of her life, including like she would cater the Filipino parties. So, you know, there were also, you know, there were always like ensaymada baking in the oven, and like, you know, she was always making flan, you know, like she would just be cooking endlessly, all this stuff. So I grew up, you know, eating Filipino food and then like garbage, like American fast food. And like my mom was like, oh, I don't know, but you know, it wasn't my grandfather. It wasn't like my Lolo. It was like her grandfather was like a bit witchy, you know, like you know, like I think he had like, she was like, oh yeah, there were these people dancing on the water, or like these beings dancing on the water, and she was like, my grandfather said some words and they disappeared, like, and we all saw this, you know. And so like, I don't know, you know, like I just think it's really sad how much of that kind of indigenous like spiritual heritage has been lost, you know. And I know some of it has been preserved in Catholicism, and Filipinos have definitely made Catholicism their own, but I think there is a lot to be said for like whatever those spiritual traditions were that were preserved by, I don't know, my ancestors, your ancestors, our ancestors for thousands of years, you know, and that have largely been lost and are still, you know, like are still, it's like, you know, my cousins in the Philippines are always making jokes about how like, oh yeah, our ancestors used to worship the trees, you know, and I'm like, well, what's wrong with that? Like, it's better than this stuff about like, you know, stoning your wife for being disobedient, you know, like I'd rather have the trees and like all of this. I mean, you know, I don't know, that like that kind of spirituality maybe makes more sense to me than this kind of like sky father who creates the universe, you know. But it's not to say that I know very much about it, you know. Like I went through like a new age phase when I was like in high school, like for like, I don't know, like, you know, it was in like 1993. It was like among like like grunge indie rock people in my high school. Anyway, sorry, this is diverging. This has nothing to do with it really anything. I went to this really I went to a magnet school in Philly, like an academic magnet school, sort of like the Stuyvesant, Philadelphia, this place called Central, which in many ways like was maybe more formative for me than the college I went to, you know, because it like it's a situation where like at the age of 14, I was suddenly like I'm basically emancipated from my parents. You know, I was given like the Philly equivalent of a Metro card, and suddenly like they had no idea what I was doing. Like, you know, like I started doing drugs, I took up smoking, I took up drinking, like I started experimenting with all these things. I got really into like music scenes. It was just like I basically like at a very young age in a way had to start taking responsibility for my own life, you know, and like was given like this freedom. And like it wasn't even that I was rebelling from my parents, you know, although maybe there was a little bit of that. It was more just like I was handed like total freedom at like a very young age, you know. And it was like in the 90s where like you know, like things, it didn't cost that much to have a life, you know. Clothes were like we would buy our clothes at the thrift store, like we would sit around on like Philly's version of St. Mark's Place and like panhandle to get money to go to shows and to buy like 40s. I don't know, it was like a very like liberatory 4 years, you know. Like I don't think I've ever felt as free as I did then since. And like it was kind of like, I mean, you know, at the same time that it was like this this kind of lesson in personal responsibility, you know, like, oh, okay, well, you know, do I really want to take this substance? You know, like it's like responsibility for my own health, my own well-being, my own safety, like running around what at the time was like you know, like a very different city than it is now. And but at the same time, it was also a lesson in the value of irresponsibility, you know, and like, and even though I've since moving to New York, I've had to develop this kind of extreme work ethic. You know, I've become like a real workaholic, but like deep down underneath all of it, I really don't believe in work at all. Like I have a profound I don't actually believe in the work ethic. Like I've had to develop one as a survival skill, but I don't really believe in like the inherent value of work. Like I, you know, like it was like as a teenager seeing that, oh, you really don't need to, you know, like life lived without work is very full, you know, it's full of human life. And that's stuck with me, And in my own work, like a lot of my work has to do with labor and with work as a phenomenon, with how working people are treated, like the relationship of work and class. And, in the future, like I'm really interested in post-capitalist, like post-work theory and like thinking. And I'm interested in like, what does a society without these forms of labor look like? Like, what does it look like to have a society where you no longer use human beings 7 days a week to bag groceries, where you don't use human beings to, I don't know, do paperwork, where you don't use human beings basically to do repetitive drudgery, and where a human's, like a person's value is separated from labor, and we start respecting the inherent value of like, a living human being.
Well, I saw that you talked to Josh and Paul, and I don't know if they mentioned, but we've been having this extended conversation about answering just that. Like, what does it mean to associate Filipino Americanness in our work, in relationship to curating a show? What's the commonality, if there is anything? And so it's something that we've been thinking about in ways that aren't superficial. Like, what does it actually mean to be Filipino in this time, in this country? And I think it's quite confusing. So I'm Michelle Lopez. I do sculpture and installation. It's concept driven, so the concept determines the material, and a lot of it is research based. So I spend a lot of time understanding how the concept really translates through material, and within that are all of these industrial and cultural applications. And so I spend time trying to unpack all of that. And right now, my work has been veering more towards this kind of collapse of empire, collapse of familiar political, environmental structures and architectural structures in relationship to power. And so I've been working on this project, this tornado project, and it's this immersive 360 film that's projection that allows viewers to feel what it's like to be inside the eye of a storm. But it's metaphorical in the sense that there are different constellations of different storms, and some of them had to do with crowds. I've really been moved by in relationship to the pandemic, the way that gatherings happen in relationship to protests. And so I've been thinking about crowds and people as constellations and gatherings, but also really thinking about what it means to look up at the sky in terms of a kind of collapse. So so my work has been about trying to embody a kind of invisible violence, what it means to actually, a friend asked me recently, what does this have to do with you? Why are you interested? And so some of it is clearly in relationship. I'm responding to what's happening in our world right now, but also this feeling of what it means to kind of feel invisibility in the world of as a woman, as a minority, and trying to recreate that experience through objects and through installations. So I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia in the 70s. And so my parents immigrated here. They both came it was on medical visas. And, you know, my dad was training to be a doctor. My mom was a nurse, very typical, you know, Filipino story. And my dad was doing his training in Connecticut. So I was born there, and I grew up. Yeah, we had a very tight-knit Filipino community, which I think is often the case. And in terms of going to school, I basically was the only one of the only brown people in my class. And yeah, I don't know. You asked some other questions, but I've forgotten. Yeah, it was very organic and slow. So I think I first met Paul. Paul was my first Filipino artist friend, and that was very early on in the mid-90s. And what I loved about Paul was that he was already deeply connected with the Philippines in a way that I in the art community there in a way that I wasn't. And so he introduced me to Santiago Bose, who was incredibly important for me. And then I think I met Carissa kind of around this, Carissa Rodriguez, kind of around the same. And then one time, I think I was down at I think this is kind of how it started. My parents had got a big lechon, and I went down there, and, you know, and I was actually pregnant with Wolf at the time. And of course, like any good Filipino family, they give you lots of leftovers, but a lot. Like I basically had half the pig. And so I brought it back to New York, and I had a Filipino party. And I think that's where I met John Santos. And so Carissa brought John Santos and Josh Kline. And then I just kind of started slowly, and it became this thing where we didn't have to be ashamed of the food. You know, there weren't any, you know, Filipino food didn't at the time have this kind of foodie culture that so many other Asian countries have. And so it was great to get together and to be able to share the weird food that we grew up with, and to have pride in it, and then also to just be in the art world together too, and support each other that way. So I was pregnant with Wolf, so it was like 2006. And
Wow.
then I think we would do some, and then we would start to gather, because then there started to be Filipino restaurants around the city. So we would gather at those restaurants. And then, yeah, when I got that house, then we just started doing those parties then. And then it became this like crazy food cooking extravaganza where we would cook for days. But it was, and that was great in terms of for my son to just, for Wolf to just be really exposed to the food. And I think there's something just being out of the city, and there's something, I mean, I actually remember having a conversation with you also at the stove where we were like cooking and talking, but there's something about that, just almost like you're stirring something, and so you have to pour things into it. And so you pour yourself into it in a way. And I just remember you just sharing some, just what was going on with you. And yeah, I think it's something that's actually hard to do in the city, you know, like in the sense of we're out in the city, and yeah, to have that kind of space.
So you had a panel conversation in relation to your show.
Yeah, we had a conversation in relationship to our show. into my show at ICA Philadelphia. And we talked about this way that Filipino Americans don't have an identity because we're always culturally appropriating. And I think there was something rich in that in relationship to, I think what I spoke about earlier in terms of a kind of code switching and in terms of a kind of survival. It's like there's enough distance for us to step back and see, how are all of these signifiers operating and how can we manipulate them? And I think that's one of the unifying themes that we found in terms of all of our works, was that I do think our work is very American, or it's critiquing American culture. And I would say that the way that it's Filipino is also the way that I think, and I don't want to make any assumptions because I'm not Filipino, and I always feel a little bit like, I feel like I've made some statements that maybe Filipinos might take offense to, but just through American eyes, I see that the Philippines is also really good at code switching. They're good at mimicry. They're good at appropriating particularly American culture and absorbing it and translating it in a way that I think is really interesting. Like that they wholeheartedly embrace it in some ways not. I think where I feel a bit of a loss in terms of being American and also thinking about being Filipina is because I also feel this since the pandemic is the way that Indigenous culture has totally been lost, or that it's completely been submerged. And I really felt this when I went to Batad in the rice terraces a couple years ago, and really saw how the tribe there really held on to their identity, really fought for it, really refused a kind of westernization. And I found that so refreshing that, wow, it's like I've been westernized in ways that have wiped out any kind of a true Filipino identity. So I think what's confusing for us is this, or for me is always this question of, in terms of a kind of colonialization, Filipino identity has gotten so distorted, and what is an authentic Filipino identity? Is it indigenous? Because it was colonized for so long. Is it this? It is that kind of cultural hybridity, but it's always, I think, where it gets confusing is that because we're in the United States, we want a certain kind of validity, or at least I'm using signifiers that are very Western in terms of using cars and thinking about minimalism in relationship to Star Wars. It's like I'm using all of that, but and I mentioned Santiago Bose because visiting him in Baguio in the mid-90s was really important for me, because he said, and he was kind of grappling with some of these questions, like if I were to use, and he was using authentically indigenous materials that didn't have any kind of archival quality in his installations, and would that be validated? Would that be recognized? And so the question in terms of agency, I think, has always been a question for all of us. Like if we want our work to communicate, it is to a Western audience. So I think it confuses this idea of
Yeah.
Filipino American identity already, because people are like, what is that? Like who, like, or it gets so kind of reduced in terms of an Asian identity, which is why I get so confused about when we talk about Asian identity, even in the United States. It's like there's so many different hierarchies within that. And so I think the complexity of that, it's, you know, being Filipino American is so different from being Korean American, right? I think there's, yeah, I think if anything, it's like Filipinos tend to push out the Filipinos, which I think is really sad, because there's more agency in being American. I think I was struck by how sculptural the rice terraces were. I mean, it's like 4,000 years old. It's so connected to the land. And I think that's what struck me about our guide, was how connected she was to the land. And yeah, I felt like I wanted to understand that more. Because then, you know, you go to Manila and it's so, none of that is there.
What a wonderful opportunity.
It was amazing. It was great. It was, yeah. And then I got to spend time with my mom. And then she passed away in January of 2018. So I was so grateful that I saw her. Yeah.
Is your dad in the Philippines now?
Yeah, he is. He loves it. He loves it.
Yeah.
Um,
And you get to
yeah, he's
visit
really
him?
connected to the land because, you know, he went to this agrarian high school, and yeah, I think he was about to sign up to take more classes, and I think a relative stopped him along the way and said, you should not go here anymore. Like you should go to college. And so yeah, so it's things like that. He's like, I think that, yeah, the relative was like, you're too smart to stay here, you should go to college. So yeah. But now it's cool to see him, like he's developing this property and it's totally sculptural. So
That's amazing.
yeah, so it's nice just to see like, oh, okay. I mean, the one thing I think I should also mention is that because my dad, growing up, because my dad was a surgeon, he was also into orchids. He would connect these glucose IVs to his orchids so that they would get nourished. And so there would be IVs hanging off of these orchids and these trees. And I just remember loving the image of that. And I think when you talk about just like how that gets translated, I'm always like trying to do things like that I'm not supposed to do, to just, okay, combine these two weird things. And so yeah, so I think I get a lot of that stuff from, I think, and also it's just has more to do with the kind of survival. I feel like the Philippines has a lot of that. Like whenever I'm in the provinces, it comes out of a certain kind of need. Like I'll see how a basketball hoop is put together out of sticks. Yeah, so there's something about that third world mentality that I find really exciting and inventive, because it's like, okay, let's just, what do we need? How do we do this? So yeah, So yeah, so I try to bring that in the work, like in terms of a kind of economy of material relationships.
My name is Jian Deleon. Currently, I'm the men's fashion and editorial director at Nordstrom. Before that, I worked in men's lifestyle media for over a decade. I started at Complex magazine and worked at GQ as a style writer. I then wrote a bunch of articles for Business of Fashion about streetwear and sneakers. Really one of the first journalists to cover that beat for them specifically. And then before Nordstrom, I was the editorial director at Diaspora for about 4 years. I was a member of like Find and like the Filipino American societies, stuff like that. But for me, I've always just sort of been the kind of person that was a bit, willing to go further. I spent a lot of time in DC, just really discovering the alternative music scene there, and just sort of finding different tribes that way. So for me, it was just more about alt culture and different subcultures than anything. I never really, I had that side of me that was very interested in reading like the work of Helen Zia, Ronald Takaki, et cetera, and that kind of quote unquote woke Asian lit at the time. And it was formative in that sense. But for me, it was that dichotomy of learning about subcultures like punk and skateboarding. And I mean, I would think it was really discovering the history of Zephyr skateboards and Ben Fong Torres and what he was doing in California that blew my mind more than like anything I was reading in school. But just the fact that there could be Filipino Americans and Asian Americans participating in alternative culture and holding space there, that blew my mind. In the same way that like someone like Qbert or Chad Hugo being a hip hop DJ or Grammy nominated producer and half of the Neptunes, like that kind of impact is what was more indelible on me than anything in academia. I'm just a child of the internet. I have blog life tattooed on my fingers on the keyboard side. And, I'm part of this generation of content creators and internet digital natives who, grew up half of my life online and found more community in digital forums and blogs and Instagram and Twitter more than like in real life. And so, for me, I feel like I'm part of this generation where the whole IRL to URL experience was always on the same playing field, right? It wasn't weird to meet people off the internet around that time that I was in college. Like you would meet people from the hip hop scene or breakdancing or like just whatever, even like the niche subcultural fashion scene. Like there were these forums called like Super Future and Style Forum and even like the Hypebeast forums where you would just meet like-minded people and meet at a shop. I work across all of our men's teams from designer to sportswear and activewear, and I really just help connect the dots between what's happening in different spaces. I think what a lot of what I do, it comes from a genuine empathy from who our customer is, what he might be looking for. I would say I have a very realistic view of fashion where, yes, I love designers. I love what's happening on the high end and luxury end, but I also still have an appreciation for more accessible clothes and the sort of commercial world of fashion where it might not necessarily be what's on a runway, but it's also in my closet and it's in most people's closets. And that's how, majority of people dress anyway, right? It's like a mixture of high and low that is par for the course these days, but even just like 15 years ago is viewed as sort of novel. I feel like a lot of what we typify as like the Filipino American aesthetic or what it means to be Filipino American occupies the space of nostalgia, right? And then when I say nostalgia, I do mean in like the truest sense where there's a bit of like a tinge of the heart, right, and a longing for something that we can't necessarily have anymore to that. And I think the best example, or not the best example, but a more recent example is I had a Bodhi jacket made. So Bodhi is this brand founded by this designer, Emily Adams Bodhi from Atlanta, who, and what she does is a lot of her pieces are made from either dead stock vintage fabrics or vintage inspired fabrics, but she has a program called the Senior Cord Program, which is inspired by a tradition at Purdue University where graduating students would draw and illustrate on their corduroy pants and corduroy jackets to commemorate as like a yearbook signing, essentially. And it's something that's, another sort of prep staple, like Ralph Lauren's revisited this in the past. There's a couple of other labels that do something similar, but Bodhi's become one of the brands that's been synonymous with this certain cornflower corduroy aesthetic on like a utilitarian workwear jacket. And I had a fever dream that I had one after I had lunch with this gentleman named Junya Matano, who he works for that streetwear brand Kith. He oversees its Japanese division, and he has a really sick one that is all New York references. And we had lunch, and then that night I dreamt that I had one that had a bunch of Filipino references, specifically Filipino snacks that I grew up eating. So there was like chippy, there was the star margarine I used to eat with rice growing up, mais queso and ube ice cream for Magnolia. And so I just like the next day I woke up and I just had that image in my head of this like crazy Filipino snack themed jacket. And so I just compiled a folder of probably 50 images. And then I commissioned, this piece that was just like, what I noticed is that Bodhi has this aesthetic that sort of post-colonial, it's mid-century. A lot of the things that she favors in her designs are from like the 1950s, 1940s, whether it's like old rocking horse images or like antiquated milk crates, like that kind of branding and that kind of specific design era. And a lot of Filipino branding, the logos of the snacks and like the companies I was putting forth dovetailed with that nicely. So it was like very meta, because if you look at like the Goldilocks Bakery logo, or you look at like the photorealism of like the 7D mango imagery and how richly that's drawn, it's not necessary for me. It wasn't just like, oh, it happens to be Filipino and I think it's cool, let's do it, but it ties into what Bodhi is about as a brand, which is really like preservation of craft, preservation of ideas, and this true love and appreciation of art history and aesthetic history, and wanting to push that forward to a new generation. And so, it's a bit more meta than just I want a Filipino snack jacket, right? It came from a true understanding that it worked, and this is why it worked on a fundamental level between what I wanted to do, but also what the brand represented. And I posted on Instagram, and I guess you can call it like a viral garment, which is hilarious. But it's one of my favorite pieces, and it's one that it tells a story. It gets people talking, and to me, that's like what fashion pieces should do, right? It's like whether it's Pharrell's Vivienne Westwood hat at the Grammys, I think it's crazy, but also amazing that like this particular jacket has become a meme that gets passed on through the internet, but also pushes forward the idea that the Filipino aesthetic and the idea of like these brands that everyone grew up with can become a dot connector across different generations for people who appreciate fashion, people who appreciate snacks. And I think it's awesome, right? Because then it's like it's bridge that gap in ways that like someone like seeing someone like Chad Hugo be on like the cover of an album bridge the gap for people who like didn't know they could be into those things at the same time. And I think it's cool to think that I've created this sort of conduit for, I have a lot of Filipino friends who love Bodhi, and then when they saw that, they're like, okay, cool, like it's great to see that I'm being represented at that kind of level. So it's really cool.
I thought that I was like, well, my entire life I've been playing by ear. And I think you and I have worked on that, a concept of playing things by ear. My approach to music and DJing and performing is playing by ear. The trajectory that my work has been on since I was a teenager, if I can call that the beginning of my work, that has all been played by ear. My participation in the communities that have given me access to basically interact and have the fortune of like expressing myself has all been played by ear. And I'm in a period right now of my work of trying to understand what are the forces that arbitrate what are the forces that give you permission to participate in those spaces, right? So when you talk to me, when you first asked me, do you want to speak about Filipino aesthetic with regard to music, and immediately in my heart I knew what that was, right? And but to try and use words to express it, I think, is really difficult, especially if an aesthetic is like a formal quality that can either be heard or seen and quantified, right? So back to what you just said about a pattern, right? So like as soon as you can see a pattern in something, you can start to call it a language in some ways. You can identify its traits, and you start to understand what is the aesthetic of that. The first thing I thought was that in music, at least from my experience with it, the Filipino aesthetic is actually, it's a bit of a simulacra, meaning Filipinos have this ability to sort of reproduce and imitate, but not only that, remix, right? So, being from, the generation that I grew up in DJ culture, it manifests in a lot of different ways. I think a lot of times people don't know how to like deconstruct the action of a DJ. So I was just DJing last weekend, and somebody came up to me and they said, is this your mix? And I actually inside for a split second, I was confused about the question, because I was thinking, of course this is my mix. But I think that person was also asking if the music that I was playing was my music. So a DJing is like a performative role, plays an interesting mediation in this idea of like representing music to an audience. And I think the first thing I thought of when you asked me about a Filipino aesthetic, obviously was, I thought about being in the Bay Area in the early 90s and how for the first time I saw that Filipino people were associated with the development of a musical style, or the development of a language, right? And that being turntablism. And I used to watch Qbert and his crew exercise this new language. And within the culture of hip hop and turntablism, I think Filipino people are recognized as like a foundational voice in the development of that art. And so in the act of like scratching and beat juggling and actually composing like a turntablist composition, I think it's hard to reflect on that as like strictly, obviously belonging to a culture, right? Especially Filipino. But isn't it appropriate that within the same breath, you could also say that cover bands coming from the Philippines during my father's generation is also kind of like an aesthetic, and so, the first thing I thought about when you had asked me this, I thought about, I'm excited to talk about music and the complexity of how there is a Filipino language in music, but it's really more about, it's a performance. Like it's the aesthetic of it is re-performing and performing other people's like art, like remix, right? And how does that fit within the framework of like post-colonial thought and expression, right? I asked my dad, when I thought really deeply about Filipino cover bands coming from Manila, I thought, you could just call your dad, because my father played drums in a band in the Philippines near a US military base when he was a late teenager. And entertaining those American GIs in the Philippines gave him this opportunity to bring his band to Vietnam during the war. And he performed American rock and roll pop songs and entertained American GIs during the Vietnam War. I had a pretty long conversation with him about that. And one of my main questions for him was about why he didn't think to write original music, right? So being born in the generation I am born in, having a garage band or like writing your own music, I think it seemed to be, when I was growing up, a bit of a possibility. When my dad was practicing, he said that one thing he said to me is like, why would I want to write my own music when there's so much great music out there already, and I just want to perform it, right? So then that's created, I think, for me, a really complex thought that I was never able to sort through. This idea of like creating capital with your own artwork, like so like he never even thought it didn't even occur to him that, oh, I should write music. It wasn't even a part of like his understanding of his role in society, right? So then fast forward to like the turntablism years, and it's interesting because I don't think there's any dialogue or discourse around whether or not that form that they're creating belongs to them, or if it belongs to someone else, or do you need permission? I mean, Qbert, those guys wrote like scratch records, which were basically basically like a piece of vinyl that has sound effects like with 2 seconds in between them, so that you can jog around and you can find different samples to scratch with. And that is essentially the development of the instrumentation, right? And so this like augment in this sort of like modification of an instrument and how it's performed, I think becomes a part of the Filipino instrument. And I think there is an aesthetic in that, and so I don't know if it's ever been classified, as cultural practice, but if I were to think about it now, I'd be like, growing up in the 90s, like being a turntablist, that might be cultural practice, so that's kind of in a nutshell, like my thoughts around what you had asked me the first time around, and sort of where I'm at thinking about it today. So my name is John Santos. I practice in my studio as a graphic designer to bring in money to support my job, which also I think it sort of has created a complex understanding of my thought around art and how I relate to those. It's created basically a complex thought for me to consider how I spend my time as a totality. So part of my time, I think I quantify or I qualify my art these days as organizing people in retreat scenarios, right? And Untopo, I think, to be a container for this art that I've sort of like been experimenting with for a while. The artwork being the gathering of people in and around a sacred site, and that is sort of an evolution of the complex practice that I have been engaged in, DJing, organizing parties, organizing people, from Detroit to San Francisco to New York, and now with me living in Hawaii, contemplating what it means to actually organize people. And I think of that practice, like all of it, the curating, the cultural production that goes into actually shaping an event, and picking the people to work with as creative partners. I consider that to be my art right now. And coincidentally, you're catching me at a time where I've really thought it through a lot further than the last time I saw you. And I think a lot of it has to do with continually asking myself the question of, like, within these spaces where I practice and where I organize people, like, what are the forces at play that actually allow permission or give you access to create that art? So when I saw you, Nancy, when we were at the Buddhist temple in upstate New York, it's a pretty straightforward situation where the property is owned and run by a Buddhist monk from Korea, and he gave me access to use that space to create and perform our artwork. And so now I'm kind of reflecting on a lifelong journey, starting from like my DJing years, and occupying and playing in abandoned buildings in downtown Detroit, to then like working in underground clubs in San Francisco. And currently what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to like deconstruct or try to understand the cultural effects and the spatial like how we relate to these different spaces that I've been navigating. And ultimately, where does that go? And how does that relate to the trajectory of my life, my identity, where I come from, being a first generation Filipino American born in Detroit, now living in Hawaii. I'm trying to understand like what is my place within all of that, if that makes sense. In 2003, my graphic design work, I was actually starting to establish like a signature style that was flat. It was really inspired by skateboard graphics and flat stylized graphics from Europe and Japan. And I was kind of bringing like a craft approach to it. So I was drawing a lot of letters and screen printing. I was printmaking a lot, and printmaking was actually a large part of like how I was like deriving form. And so like I could only describe that work that time as being like flat hyper postmodernism, in that I was like mixing a lot of different styles. So it was also happening during like a street art kind of boom in San Francisco. And so I actually didn't, I was trying to ride the line of like keeping my work, my graphic design work, within the language of like graphic design with a tinge of like street art. And I was also I was using illustrative forms, but I shied away from that because I saw that there were other designers working around me who, around that time, 2003, when I moved to New York, there were other designers who were using that style. And I thought I just didn't feel comfortable ever being recognized by one single style, which is the antithesis to developing an art career. Because in other words, like I think people, they want to know you by your style. But in 2003, I thought, I want to get really good at working with ideas and concepts. And so San Francisco was very craft oriented at that time. I don't think anybody really took you seriously unless you knew how to draw or make something with your hands. So the craft part of that was pretty high. My impression of like whether or not I needed those kind of skills being in San Francisco was really high. As soon as I moved to New York, I shared a studio with this art collective from New York and Paris called Surface to Air while I was working a day job designing television graphics. And I think I saw a lot of this amazing work they were doing that was being shown internationally. And I was really inspired what they were doing. And I remember this piece they did with Sanrio. They basically, they were commissioned by Sanrio to create some work. I don't remember what it was actually for, but what they did was they went to England and they commissioned like the creation of like a crop circle in the shape of Hello Kitty's, the Hello Kitty like icon. And then someone went into a helicopter and photographed it. And the final work of whatever it was they were doing was like this photograph of a crop circle of Hello Kitty. And I remember thinking, I was like, I want to make conceptual work, like work that is not necessarily like, they didn't touch that. It was almost the opposite. Like going to New York in 2003 was the opposite of what San Francisco was about. San Francisco was about like, what can you do with your hands? How can you draw? What colors are you using? Whereas when I moved to New York, it was really more about what kind of ideas do you have? And I actually switched tracks almost immediately. While I was working at Brand New Scroll during the day, it was a highly competitive workplace with a lot of really talented artists who could create a fully rendered airbrushed like illustration of basketball players slam dunking overnight. So I thought I need to stop doing flat graphic style. And within 3 years, I learned how to illustrate and create imagery using a multitude of tactics like photoshopping, 3D modeling, using my hand a lot of different ways, using crayon, pastel. Like, in fact, the first 3 years I moved to New York, I learned almost every method. I learned watercolor. I learned only because the creative environment I was in for my day job for creating commercial work, it was like this super hyper aesthetic zone where like so much imagery was being created. And in order to compete in an environment, you also had to be able to adapt. So I was developing graphics for MTV. And like every young motion graphics designer gets this moment if they're working hard enough where you get to create like packages for different artists and shows. Like I shouldn't say every motion graphic, but motion graphic designer. But at that time, being in New York, I think the holy grail was getting like your cool graphics on the television. And for a little while there was like art directing these MTV 10 spots, and I made stuff for MIA and like Death Cab for Cutie and all these indie bands for like a while. And so every week I would think, okay, I need to generate a bunch of different styles because you couldn't go back to meet with MTV the next week and show them the same stuff. What is exciting me now is this idea that since I'm in Hawaii, I'm geographically, spiritually, and psychically getting closer to understanding my Filipino-ness, meaning like, what does that mean in all of its contexts? Like, what does that mean to me being here in this community, where there are a lot of different groups of people who are reconciling or trying to relate. You know, it's like a long trajectory of people here who have like a longer history and different traumas, but similar in some ways. And so I'm excited in sort of like learning more about what is my place in all of this, right? And what I mean by that is like who am I to you know, to create a space for other marginalized groups, right? Like even if I was creating a space for Filipino people to express and benefit from, what exactly is that? You know, like what is this idea of like creating an entity or like a brand and like expressing it in a way, it just, the way it fits into the world right now, it's not making sense, you know? And that's what I don't think excited is the word. That's what I'm left wondering about.